Hi, I'm Bob Breyer, and we're going to talk about the great pharaohs of Egypt. But let me start by telling you what I'd like to do with this course. My hope is that by presenting a history of Egypt to you, through the lives of the pharaohs, you'll be able to remember it. We're not going to talk about dates. Everybody always forgets them anyway. What we're going to do is try to present personalities, the people who made Egypt great. Now, we're going to have 12 lectures, and we're going to talk about pharaohs like Narmer, the first king of Egypt. Then, from Narmer, we're going to go to somebody you've probably never heard of, Sneferu. But he's the pharaoh who taught Egypt how to build pyramids. So, through the lives of these kings, we're going to learn more about Egyptian history. After Sneferu, we're going to go to Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled Egypt as king, not queen. So she is, in a sense, the first of the women's livers. After Hatshepsut, we'll talk about Akhenaten, an absolutely unique pharaoh who changed the religion, turned it into monotheism, and almost destroyed Egypt. And then from him, we go to his son, Tutankhamun, the most famous pharaoh of all times. And we'll need 2 lectures for him, because he's so important and so intriguing. After Tutankhamun, we'll talk about Ramses the Great, the pharaoh who ruled Egypt for 67 years. We'll need 2 lectures for him. After Ramses, we'll go to the late period. We'll talk about kings who were Nubians. That's in the south, the modern Sudan. They were the black pharaohs of Egypt. They went north, conquered Egypt, and ruled. So we'll talk about Nubians. And then we go to the very end of Egyptian history, when the Greeks ruled. We'll talk about Alexander the Great, who conquers Egypt and starts Greek rule. And then we go to the Ptolemies. These were kings who made Egypt great, but in a way also destroyed it. You'll see. And the very last Ptolemy is Cleopatra, the last ruler of Egypt, and we'll end the course with Cleopatra. So my hope is that through these kings, and I call them kings even though there are women there, they're ruling as kings, through these kings' lives, you'll get a feeling for Egyptian history, but also the personalities. Now, let me say one thing about this approach, this kind of almost like a people's magazine for ancient Egypt. I mean, as I say, my hope is that you'll remember, that you'll be able to say, yes, he was the pharaoh who did this, who did that, But I'm bucking 2,500 years of tradition. My thesis in this course is that what made Egypt great were the people, individuals who did great things. But there's a tradition that goes against this. And let me tell you about the other tradition, just to be fair. And it starts with a man named Herodotus. Now, Herodotus was a Greek tourist who went to Egypt in 450 BC, right? So he's an early tourist. Didn't speak the language, needed guides, worked through interpreters, but he was trying to learn as much as he could about Egypt. And Herodotus made the famous statement, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Now, he meant it literally. He meant that Egypt was actually given by the Nile. What he means is this. Every year, the Nile overflowed its banks. And when it overflowed its banks, the Nile deposited rich topsoil. So both sides of Egypt, both sides of the Nile, had an annual renewal of black topsoil on either side. What that means is you don't need fertilizers. The land's never going to grow weak, in growing power. You can grow more food than you need. So, in a sense, Herodotus is saying what made Egypt great is the Nile. It had geography working for it. Why? Egypt could grow more food than it needed. Throughout its history, Egypt was known for growing food. It had more food than it needed. Now, if you can grow more food than you need, you can do all kinds of things. For example, you can have a standing army. You can support a bunch of guys, 40,000, 50,000 guys, give them food, and they don't contribute anything immediately to your economy. But you've got a professional army, and that can give you a tremendous advantage. And that's why Egypt ruled the Near East, says Herodotus. So for Herodotus, the whole point is what makes Egypt great isn't the pharaohs. It's not hard work. It's the Nile. Right? So that's the tradition that I'm bucking. I'm going to say, you can have all kinds of wonderful things with the Nile, But what made Egypt great for me are the personalities. They had great leaders, and that's what did it. Now, one more geographical thing for you to remember throughout the 12 lectures. The Nile flows from south to north. It is the only major river in the world flowing the wrong way, right? So on the map, it's going uphill. So when we talk about Upper and Lower Egypt, it refers to the direction of the Nile. So when you go up the Nile, you're actually going south. When you go down the Nile, you're going north. So for that reason, it's just the opposite of what you'd think. In other words, when you think of Upper Egypt, it's in the south. And when you think of Lower Egypt, it's in the north. So just remember that as we go. I'll remind you as we go through it, don't worry. But this is an important thing. So the Nile is crucial to Egypt. It certainly is. I'm not denying that. Everybody lived along the banks of the Nile. Remember, these were not desert people, the Egyptians. They didn't go out into the desert. They hated the desert. They didn't have camels. That's introduced much later. Everybody lived along the Nile, stayed by the Nile, and they lived and died by the Nile. So the Nile is important, but I'm saying it's the leaders that really made Egypt great. And now it's time for you to meet our first leader, the first king of ancient Egypt, Narmer. Now, when does Narmer live? The best guess is around 3200 BC, right? So he's living 5,000 years ago. Just before Narmer's time, Egypt was divided into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, right? And they had two kings, a king of Upper and a king of Lower. And the king was symbolized by his crown. The pharaoh in the south, the one in the south, wore a tall white crown. And the pharaoh of the north wore a shorter red crown with a little feather in the front. So we had two crowns. It's interesting that a crown is a sign of authority. I mean, we still have it today, right? Policemen wear special hats, soldiers wear, military wear hats, doormen wear hats. It's a sign of something making you special. And the crown was the sign of the king. So we have two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. I'll tell you something very, very interesting about crowns. For 3,000 years, Egyptian pharaohs wore crowns. The tall white crown, the red crown. No crown has ever been found. Never. We have Tutankhamun's tomb, which was found intact, right? Everything packed in there, gold, treasures, no crown. Now, why? I'll tell you my theory. My theory is that the crown was magical, that it was believed to have magical powers. Whoever put it on became powerful, strong, invincible. And I think there was only one crown at any one time. In other words, I think the crown is passed on from king to king. It was the one thing the pharaoh couldn't take with him to the next world. Kind of like the crown jewels of England, right? There's only one crown jewels, and after Elizabeth dies, it goes to somebody else, and after she, it goes to somebody else. So I think there was only one crown in existence, and that crown was passed down from pharaoh to pharaoh. So I don't think we're ever going to find it. I think it's gone, but the crown was the symbol of kingship. And then sometime around, as I say, maybe 3200, maybe 3150, don't worry about dates, Narmer unifies Egypt. Now, what does he do? What does it mean to unify Egypt? He is a king of the south. He marches north and conquers the king of the north, and Egypt becomes one nation. So what I want to show you in this first introduction to Narmer is how Narmer sets a pattern, establishes a political schema for Egypt that is going to make Egypt great for 3,000 years. Now, very important is a document that I want to talk about. Today you're going to hear about the Narmer palette. It is the first historical document in the world. There is no historical document earlier than the Narmer palette. It is a large slate object. Now, when I say large, it's about 22 inches high. It's maybe a foot wide. And it's a palette. Now, palette. Immediately everybody thinks of an artist palette. And that's not bad. An artist palette is used to mix paints. You mix paints on it, and you get the color you want, and then you start painting. This was a palette that was also used for mixing. It's slate, smooth stone. The ordinary palette was smaller than the Narmer palette, though. It's about maybe 9 inches across, and sometimes they're shaped like fishes. So it's a nice smooth piece of slate. Think of a tile on a roof, on a slate tile, or something like that. And the Egyptians ground cosmetics on it. Everybody in ancient Egypt wore cosmetics. Everybody. Now, they put them on their eye, right? Under the eyes often. Now, you often see football players wearing black under the eye. That's exactly what the Egyptians were doing. It absorbs the glare of the sun. And in a desert country, it's important. So on their palettes, they could grind their cosmetics. If you want to be really zippy, if a woman wanted to really look attractive, she could take some malachite, green stone, grind it, mix it in with fat, and that becomes your cosmetic. Even today, by the way, the basis of all cosmetics is fats. I mean, I will never forget, there's a diversion, I gotta tell you, I once went to a chicken store called Pudgy's, which is in New York, and they specialized in chicken that didn't have skin. They took the skin off for people who are on diets and be more healthful. And I remember asking the kid behind the counter, I said, what do you do with the chicken skins? I sort of imagine thousands of chicken. I said, well, we have huge buckets of them, and somebody from a cosmetic company comes every night and picks up the buckets, and they make cosmetics. So it comes out of ancient Egypt, mixing your cosmetics with fats. And that's what the palette was used for. Now, the average guy had a small palette. This is big. It couldn't have been used by a person. It's quite different. It's what we call a ceremonial palette. It is used in temples. Now, in an Egyptian temple, there were statues of the gods. You would have a bronze statue, maybe 3 feet high even, of the god Amun, if it's a temple to Amun. You could have a statue of the cat goddess, Bastet. And in the Holy of Holies, these statues were kept in shrines. Every day, the priests would enter the temple, open the doors to the shrine, and anoint the statue of the god with cosmetics. And this Narmer palette, which is really fancy, and it's carved on both sides, decorated, is probably one of these temple palettes. Now, the thing that makes the Narmer palette so special, everyday palettes were flat because you want to just grind your cosmetics. This is carved on both sides, and it tells a story. And as I said, the story is of the unification of Egypt and Narmer conquering. Now for the story. On the first side of the palette, we see a king. And we can tell he's a king because he has a crown, the tall white crown. And he is standing above an enemy. He holds the enemy by the hair. And in his hand, he has a mace. Now, a mace is basically a rock on a stick. It's a round rock which is hollowed out, put on a shaft, and it's used not unlike an axe, say a small hand axe, to smash your enemy's head. So he has a mace in his hand, holding the enemy by the hair, and he's about to smash him. Now, this is a pose, the smiting pose we call it, that is going to be used in Egypt for 3,000 years. 3,000 years after Narmer, the king is going to be shown in exactly the same pose, smiting his enemy. Right? So we have Narmer, white crown, smiting his enemy. Now, how do we know he's Narmer? Right? There are so many firsts on the Narmer palette, I can't emphasize how important it is. We have the first hieroglyphic inscriptions, the first real writing in ancient Egypt on the Narmer palette. At the top of the palette is a little rectangle. That rectangle represents the palace facade. It looks like there's a door going through and a couple of columns maybe. It's very stylized. We call it the serach. This is a palace facade. Okay. Now, inside that rectangle are two little figures drawn. One is a fish, and the other is a chisel. A fish and a chisel. Now, the fish was pronounced nar, and the chisel is pronounced mer. Narmer. This is the man who's in the palace. So that's how we know the king is named Narmer, from fish chisel. So another thing to pick up from the Narmer palette is, I think if you all gathered, it's a picture of a fish, it's a picture of a chisel, but we're not talking about fishes and chisels. Hieroglyphs are not phonetic. They're not just phonetic. They're not just pictographic. They're mixtures. See, everybody thinks at first hieroglyphs are all just picture writing. No, some are, some aren't. Then other people may jump to the conclusion, well, they're phonetic. No, they're not just phonetic. They're a mixture. In this case, these two hieroglyphs represent sounds. They are phonetic. And Narmer is our king. So we've got Narmer wearing the white crown, smiting. Now, on the same side of the palette, we see a falcon. And the falcon has a captive who looks like the guy that Narmer was smiting, with a ring through his nose. And the falcon's holding the string. So he's got this guy by the nose, literally. Now, the falcon is the god Horus. And throughout Egyptian history, the pharaoh will be called the Horus on earth. So in the Narmer palette, we are establishing another tradition that the pharaoh is going to be associated with the falcon god Horus. So we've got Narmer as a falcon holding the enemy through a ring through the nose. He is smiting him with a mace. Narmer is capturing the north. That's only one side of the palette. Flip it over, and you've got the conclusion of your story. What's going on the other side of the palette? Well, on the other side of the palette, we have Narmer again. And even better, in front of him, right in front of him, is a chisel and a fish. He's named. That's his name, Narmer. But this time, he's not wearing the white crown. He's wearing the red crown. He has conquered the king of the north, and he's wearing his crown. Narmer is the first king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Egypt is now united under one ruler. Narmer is shown in a procession, walking in a procession. Now, one of the things you spot right away on the Narmer palette is how big Narmer is. He is twice as large as anyone else on the palette. This is another tradition started on the Narmer palette that is going to continue for 3,000 years. It's called hierarchical proportions. What it means is the more important the guy, the bigger he is. And Narmer is way bigger than anybody else. So we've got Narmer much bigger in a procession. In front of him, right in front of him, is a little figure, a man, much smaller. And he's kind of hunched over. It's a strange posture. It's almost as if he's carrying a weight. And there are a couple of hieroglyphs behind him. And what they say is, really, it's early hieroglyphs for vizier. He is the second in charge. It shows that Narmer has come with his assistant, a vizier. And the reason he's hunched over is, if you look very closely at that Narmer palette, he's wearing a strange garment. He is wearing a leopard skin. That is a sign of authority. And what he has to do, because he's wearing a leopard skin, which is both heavy and not easily tailored, is he's holding it on. That's why he's walking like this. So you've got Narmer with his vizier. They're marching in a procession. You have people with banners, pennants, signs of areas, right? And they're walking towards a group of people who have been beheaded and their hands are tied behind their backs. Right? Narmer has conquered, and he is showing what happens to the enemy. Now, maybe most important for the Narmer palette, maybe the most important feature on it, is right beneath this scene is another scene of two mythological animals. They look like leopards with necks that are even longer than giraffes. And the necks are intertwined, forming a circle. Now, I think that the circle is where the cosmetics were ground. I think that's your smooth spot where you could put your fat and your pigment, grind it, and you'd put it on the statue. But I think the intertwined necks of the two animals represents the joining of Upper and Lower Egypt. I mean, this is, in a sense, Egypt's Declaration of Independence, or it's something, it's the Magna Carta, it's something like that. But this palette is showing you what happens when Egypt really becomes the first nation in the history of the world. Beneath that scene of the intertwined animals, beneath the scene, is one other scene that's important. It's a bull. And the bull has broken down a wall around a city, and he's trampling on someone. Now, the bull is the second symbol of the pharaoh that's going to be used in Egypt. We have the falcon, and now we have the bull. The bull, of course, the idea is the power. And this is the pharaoh, has broken down the walls of the city, captured the city, and is trampling on the enemy. So Narmer has really done a great thing, and he's saying it. Now, one last thing I should say about the palette. It's a kind of detail that I like. Nobody knows this, and it's something I'm not sure what to make of, but I think it's important. It arose when I was waiting in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where the palette is. It's on display on the first floor. As soon as you go in, it's the thing you see. Everybody who comes to Egypt goes to the Egyptian Museum, and they see the Narmer palette. It is like the Declaration of Independence for Egypt. It is important. I was waiting for somebody, and I was supposed to meet him by the palette. He said, meet by the palette. Now, typical person was Egyptian, was late. I was waiting for him, and I have nothing to do. I'm waiting around. I say, I might as well really look closely at the palette. I've never really stared at it for a long time. I've got time, I guess. So I'm looking at the palette, and I'm looking, and I try to look on the other side. I go around it. It's upright. You can walk around it. And I realized something. As I say, I'm not sure what to make of it, but I think it might be important. The two sides of the palette were carved by different people. The same artist did not carve the front and the reverse. Now, why do I say that? Remember the rectangle, the serech, that's the palace facade? If you look at that on one side of the palette and then the other, you will see totally different. They're recognizable as palace facades, but one has 4 columns, another has 2 columns. It's totally different in style. And if you look at the hieroglyphs, they're totally different. That is, hieroglyphs are a handwriting. One of the hieroglyphs that's used on the palette is a rosette, a little flower petal. One side it has 6 petals, another side it has 7. It looks totally different. One side it's elegant, the other side it's clumsy. Clearly, 2 different artists carved the different sides of the palette. I'm not sure what that means. I'll give you a suggestion, just a suggestion. It may mean that there's some time separating the carving of the first side with the carving of the second. In other words, it wasn't carved contiguously. It wasn't, all right, carve this. They do one side, and then maybe time passes. And then something else is added to the story, and they take the other side, and they carve it. And if that's true, maybe the story we're telling isn't quite right. I don't know if there's more time between the conquest or something, but there's something funny going on with the palette that maybe future historians will figure out. But it's interesting to me that this is carved by 2 different people. Now, let me say something about what Narmer has done for Egypt and why it's so important. Narmer has unified Egypt. With a unified Egypt, and Egypt under one king, you can do great things. You can have all the power concentrated in one person. Now remember, Egypt's king isn't just a king. He's a god. He's the falcon. He's Horus. He is a god on earth. Other civilizations had kings in the ancient world, in the Near East, but none had a king who was a god. And if you have all that power concentrated, you don't have to worry about committees. You don't have to worry about making decisions. He says it, it's done. This was recognized very early. For example, if you read Plato's Republic, now Plato, of course, comes much later in history, but Plato in the Republic is trying to figure out what is the best possible government. And he comes up with the answer: a government ruled by a philosopher king. Now, why a philosopher king? Well, the answer is, first, you want a philosopher because you want justice. And justice, well, who better to figure out what justice is, what's fair, than a philosopher? Why a king? Because you want absolute authority. You want this person who knows what's fair to be able to do it. He snaps his fingers, and it's done. You don't want them to have to go through committees. You want them to just be able to say, yep, let's do it, and it's done. So as early as Plato, we had a kind of intellectualizing of what Narmer's done, that if you have a strong centralized government, you can do great things. Even later, the British philosopher Hobbes, when he wrote Leviathan, he said, you know, if you don't have authority, you're going to be living in a state that's like a jungle with no law. So he said, the best thing you can possibly do, is give up your own individual rights, subjugate yourself to a monarch, he called it, have a king, and let the king dispense justice, because then we're going to be safe. We won't have robbery all the time and murder and this. So Hobbes also wanted a strong central government. And what Narmer has done is he has set up Egypt with this strong central government. We have Upper and Lower Egypt united. We have a ruler who is a king and a god, and he can do whatever he wants. Now, let me say what I mean by he can do whatever he wants. You will remember that Herodotus said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. To some extent, it is true that part of what made Egypt great is this Nile overflowing. It is. Now, imagine what it must have been like, by the way. You know there are two sources of the Nile. There's the White Nile and the Blue Nile. They flow north, merge at Khartoum, and then become one Nile. It's interesting, by the way. I've stood right at Khartoum where they merge, and you can actually see in the river two different colors. It goes for about maybe 100 yards, white and blue. You can see it. It's spectacular. Now, once a year, the Nile used to overflow its banks around July. Right? And the reason is that you get monsoon season, swelling the waters, you get melting snows from Ethiopia, and it starts rushing. The Egyptians viewed this as a magical event. They didn't understand the source of the Nile. They didn't know what caused it. And every, say, July 6th or so, the Nile would, and this is the sequence, it would turn red because of the topsoil suspended in it moving quickly. It would turn green. The vegetation that moves slower, coming up from the south, and then it would rise 30 feet. I mean, every year, magic, right? Turns red, turns green, rises 30 feet, overflows its banks. You could grow plenty of crops. Now, with Narmer unifying Egypt and having a central power, you know what he can do? And what he does do? He can order the people, we are going to grow even more food. How? We are going to dig irrigation canals. So you can marshal the people and say, okay, it's June. Let's get ready for the inundation. Everybody starts digging canals. Now, the reason you dig the canals is so that when the Nile overflows, it'll go even more inland, and you'll have more land that you can irrigate, more land that you can grow crops on, and you are going to be able to grow more crops than you could ever imagine. So with Narmer, you get this ability to marshal the forces of Egypt for the benefit of the general good. It's no longer individual people making individual decisions. It is the king calling the shots for the benefit of Egypt. Now, once you've got all this food, think of what you can do. As I mentioned, you can have a standing army. You can feed 50,000 guys who don't contribute to the economy. And if you've got a standing army, they can drill, they can practice. They're not just ragtag pulled together for a battle. These guys are pros. You can have people making weapons. You can keep these guys at the ready. And then when you want, when you're ready, you can march out and beat up any other nation in the neighborhood. And that's exactly what the Egyptians did traditionally. They went out and beat up any other nation in the neighborhood. So I think that because we have Narmer unifying, I mean, he has laid down all kinds of traditions for us of a king and a central government. He's got the crowns, he's got everything. And because of Narmer, we are going to have Egypt ruling the Near East for another 3,000 years. And he is the first king of Egypt. 300 years after Narmer, Egypt will be building pyramids. But that's next time. So I'll see you next time.